Okay, so good evening, everyone. We're really happy to be learning with all of you again. So we're back for the second session of Le David, A Song of Doubt with Professor Benjamin Sommer. As everyone's coming in, I'm going to be inviting you to join as a panelist. That means that we'll get to see your lovely faces, and you'll be able to unmute yourself when Professor Sommer pauses for questions. That being said, please keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking, and if any questions come up in between pauses, you can put them in the chat either here or on Facebook Live. And we will get back to those. So tonight we'll be continuing our close look in English and Hebrew at Psalm 27. Last week opened up a lot of different channels and ideas for a lot of us. So I'm excited to see where this takes us this time. A quick reminder, yeah, we're not going to be screen sharing, so I have put the links to the text in the chat. So feel free to look at those on your own screen. Thanks.
Thank you, Maxine. And thank you, everybody. It's nice to see people again. Let me just adjust this here. So last week, we were going through this poem line by line. We were attempting to just get a sense, especially of some of details, in particular of the line structure. Remember, I said that when we're reading ancient Hebrew poetry, it gets a little bit difficult compared to reading modern poetry, because the editions that we have from the Middle Ages, from antiquity, don't lay out the lines for us. So we've got to stop and think about the lines. So I was paying some attention to how we divide each line into its 2 or 3 constituent parts. And I tended to call those constituent parts, I tended to call them versets. We also were paying attention to just very, very specific information about some of the phrasing and how exactly we can translate these lines. And we had gotten up to, actually, I think we had gotten up to about verse 8, if I'm not mistaken. Does someone happen to remember? Anyone have recollection? It was towards the end. Okay, low. So I'm gonna start up again from about, let's say, I'm gonna start up at about verse 10, and I'll keep on reading. I'm gonna just make some comments on these last few verses, and then I want to start talking about the structure of the poem as a whole, and how thinking about the lines, the lines structure, the structure of the individual lines, helps us to think about the structure of the entire poem, and then how thinking about the structure of the entire poem helps to unlock what I think is the very, very interesting theological message of the poem. Let me start, though, with verse 10. Ki avi ve'imi azavuni v'Adonai ya'asveni. Verse 10, we can render that, indeed, my father and my mother abandoned me, or maybe left me. Actually, I don't like my translation of abandon. I think maybe left me would be a better translation. So let me try it that way. Indeed, my father and my mother left me, but it is Hashem who takes me in. The reason I don't like what I myself wrote there with abandon me is that I think the idea here isn't so much literally abandonment by a parent, but rather the possibility that the parents have died. It's just typical that parents leave children, not deliberately. I mean, that does rarely happen. Abandonment does happen. But I think that the idea here more likely is simply the fact that at some point one has to make do without that most supportive of relationships when one's parents die. Indeed, my father and my mother left me, but it is Hashem who takes me in. Verse 11, Horeni Hashem darkecha, unecheni be'orech mishor lema'an shorarai. Parent me, Hashem, teaching me your path, and lead me on a level road while my foes look on. I translate the word horeni twice. Some of you who have strong Hebrew might notice. In my translation of verse 11, that first verse set has been rendered, parent me, Hashem, teaching me your path. So I've translated horeni both as parent me and teach me. Literally speaking, the verb horeni is an imperative verb. For those of you who are into dikduk, know that this is a hifil imperative verb from the shoresh yud resh he. That shoresh or verbal root yud resh he is the root that gives us the verb lihorot, which is what we've got here, which means to teach. That's the root that gives us the word moreh and morah, which mean teacher. It's the word that also gives us it's the verbal root that gives us the word Torah. Torah, often translated as law, but literally Torah really means guidance. Torah is something that sends you in a particular direction. So fundamentally, the word horeni means teach me your path. But the word horeni reminds us of the Hebrew word horeh or horim. Horeh means parents, parent in the singular. Horim means parents in the plural. Now, etymologically, actually, the word parents, horeh or horim in the plural, is not actually related to the verb that means to teach. Horeh comes from the shoresh or the verbal root he, resh, he, whereas the verb to teach is the hifil form from the root yud resh he. So etymologically, these are two different words, but they do sound similar. Once yud resh he, the verb to teach, goes into the hifil form, it sounds a lot like the word for parent. And I think that coming right after verse 10, which mentions parents, which mentions mother and father being gone and God taking their place, given that we're following that verse, I think that the verb horeni is hinting at the idea of parents, even as it literally means teach. And that's why I've translated it this way, parent me, Hashem, teaching me your path. And then lead me on a level road. Maybe in the modern world, that image isn't as clear to us, or it's not quite as important to us. But in the ancient world, where they didn't have asphalt and they didn't have steamrollers that make a smooth road, and where there weren't, shock absorbers and so forth, roads were bumpy. And when you found a road that was less bumpy, it was more pleasant to walk on, or if you were in, let's say, in some sort of cart, to ride on. And hence the idea of a level road probably is much more prominent in biblical poetry than it would be for us. Moving on to verse 12. Al titaneni benefesh tsarai, ki kamu vi ede shaker, vifeach chamas. Don't feed me to my enemies. Yes, lying witnesses rise against me with unfair, violent testimony. That phrase, don't feed me to my enemies, is an interesting one. It could really means simply, don't give me over to what my enemies desire. The word in Hebrew, nefesh, al titaneni benefesh sarai, don't give me over into the nefesh of my enemies. Nefesh can mean desire, will, what a person wants. So this could be translated, as I note in the footnote, don't give me over to what my enemies desire. In other words, don't let my enemies desire to prevail over me. They want to defeat me, or worse. Don't let that happen. Nefesh, though, also can mean life, and it can literally mean throat or gullet, where life comes in and out because we're breathing. Nefesh can also mean breath. And so if it's that sense of where breath comes in and out, it can also have a basic meaning of throat, and therefore don't put me into the throat of my enemies could be translated rather literally, rather gorily, as don't feed me to my enemies. You'll remember that earlier on in the poem, in verse 2, which we discussed last week, we saw that the words le'echol et bisari could be interpreted in two different ways. To eat somebody's flesh could be interpreted literally as an image of cannibalism, of extreme violence against a person. But it's also in several ancient Semitic languages, we know certainly in Aramaic and in Akkadian, perhaps also in Hebrew, it can also be an idiom that means to slander somebody, and in Akkadian, to speak against somebody in a courtroom, to speak against somebody in a legal proceeding. So it's interesting to me that ambiguity in verse 2 links up with the ambiguity that we see here in verse 12. In verse 12, well, if in verse 2 we understood this phrase literally to refer to physical violence or even cannibalism, then we could understand al titaneni benefesh tsarai in verse 12 to mean don't feed me to my enemies. It's getting back to that extreme image of physical violence, literally of cannibalism back in verse 2. On the other hand, if in verse 2 we understand the word to mean slander, then in verse 12, I think we could translate this as don't give me over to my enemy's desires. Don't let my enemies desire prevail over me. They're saying false things about me. They're talking against me, maybe in a court setting, maybe in a legal proceeding. Don't let them win the case. Don't let them, or don't let their slander become well known. I actually see here, actually I never noticed this until just this moment, that I think I don't like the way that I've translated verse 2 in relation to 12. Having gone with slander for le'echolet bisari in verse 2, I should actually in verse 12 have gone with what the footnote presents. In other words, having this, because those two verses really create an ambiguity that goes either this way or that way. In the main text, I should have gone consistently in one way, and then in the footnotes the other way. I just noticed that I'm being inconsistent. I've got one possibility in the main text above, but the corresponding possibility is in the footnote for verse 12 below, and vice versa. So too late now, I guess. But anyway, I should fix this after our class is over. Verse 13. Let's just finish up the actual text. Lule he'amanti lirot betuv Adonai be'eretz chayim. Were it not for the fact that I believe that I shall see Hashem's own virtue while still alive. ... This is a really interesting verse because this verse is actually a sentence fragment, or to speak more precisely, this verse has this is you might say an if kind of a clause. It's a relative clause, and then there's no main clause. We can understand that is, this person starts a sentence, the speaker starts a sentence, but doesn't finish it. And I think we understand what the idea is. The idea is something like, were it not for the fact that I believe that I would see Hashem's own virtue while still alive, I wouldn't be able to go on. I'd be a basket case. My life would be a complete mess, something like that. But it's interesting to me that the speaker doesn't finish the thought. We'll come back to why that might be. It's interesting to me that the speaker begins a sentence and doesn't end it. And then we get the last verse, also the last poetic line, Kave'el Hashem, Chazak v'yametz libecha, v'kave'el Hashem. Hope that Hashem will come. Courage, let your mind be strong, and hope that Hashem will come. Okay, let's, we've gone through the whole text. We've finished our first session, so now we can begin the second session. I'd like to ask the question, how many stanzas do we have in this poem? Where do they begin and end? And how do we know that? How do we know that? And I'd like to suggest an answer, which is that this poem has three sections, 2 stanzas and then a conclusion, or you could say 2 stanzas and then a very, very brief stanza at the end. And there are several reasons that I'd like to suggest that this poem has 3 stanzas. One of them is actually visible to the eye, whether you're looking at the Hebrew or you're looking at the English. And that is that we see in this poem an alternation between two-part lines and three-part lines. Biblical Hebrew poetry is always built from lines. Those lines typically have two parts, but frequently have three. In this poem, we're going back and forth between them. And there are quite a number of biblical poems in which the movement from a two-part line to a three-part line indicates that we're at a stanza break, indicates that here's a boundary. This is a boundary between one part and the next part. And I think that that's going on in this poem. That also happens, just to give a few examples, that happens in Psalm 19. It happens in Psalms 9 and 10. There's a whole bunch of Psalms. Actually, Professor Robert Gordis, Zichrono Livracha, who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the middle part of the 20th century, he wrote an article in Jewish Quarterly Review pointing out, among other things, the existence of this phenomenon. And it's been later, subsequently was noted by a number of other biblical scholars as well. So I think, first of all, that the stanzas suggest that the presence of three-part lines suggests that we've got a break at the end of verse 6, and that a new stanza begins at the beginning of 7. Then we get another break where we get four three-part lines in a row. I think the first one of them is, maybe the first two, are indicating, excuse me, the end of the second stanza. So the second stanza probably ends at about verse 12. And then we've got a concluding section that consists only of three-part lines, that is to say, two three-part lines in a row in verses 13 and 14. Now, so far, this is just a theory. I've given one reason to suggest that we've got three different sections, and that's the presence of these longer lines. But that on its own doesn't really prove anything. There are other biblical poems where we just go back and forth between two-part lines and three-part lines, basically randomly. So at this point, this is only a theory. But let me make another point. What I'm calling the first stanza always refers to God in the third person. In the first stanza, the speaker talks about God, but in the first stanza, the speaker never speaks to God. When we get to literally the first word of what I'm claiming is the second stanza, the word Shema in verse 7, listen, hear, then suddenly we are addressing or the speaker is addressing God in the second person. The speaker is no longer talking about God. Now the speaker is talking to God, and that remains the case consistently through at least through most of this stanza, through the end of verse 9. It switches quickly in verse 10, but goes back to second person in verses 11 and 12. And then in verse 13, we get an interesting mix. We go back to a third person reference to God in verse 13. Again, the speaker is talking about God. And then in verse 14, we actually again get an imperative verb. So that's a verb, a second person verb. It's speaking to somebody. But here, all of a sudden, it seems to be speaking to the speaker of the psalm. That is the word kaveh and chazak, hope and be strong. Those are spoken to the worshiper. We might wonder, is it the case that here the worshiper is speaking kind of to himself or to herself? Or is it that there's suddenly another voice in the psalm? Sometimes in the Psalms, there's more than one speaker, there's more than one's voice. Psalm 91 is a great example of that. For those of you familiar with the Saturday night Ma'ariv service, on Saturday night, we add Psalm 91 to the regular Ma'ariv service. And that's a psalm that just goes back and forth between different voices. And unless you figure out who the different speakers are, basically the psalm makes no sense. There are other psalms where it may be the case, there is a theory here. Let me just turn that phone off. Sorry about that. There are other cases in which, in the book of Psalms, where it would appear to be the case that a a prophet in the temple, or maybe a Levite on the temple staff, is addressing the worshiper. Most of the psalm is spoken in the voice of a person who is pleading for something, but at some points at the end or in the middle of the psalm, there seems to be an address to the worshiper, an address in which somebody is conveying a divine message to the worshiper, to the person petitioning. So maybe that's going on here. Maybe a prophet or a Levite in the temple is responding to the person who recites this psalm. And the truth is, I don't think we have to decide between these two possibilities. This last line, it may be that in some temples in ancient Israel, or at some historical periods in ancient Israel, a worshiper would recite the entire psalm, including the last line, in which the worshiper is sort of addressing himself or addressing herself. And it may be that at other times or in other temples, other Levites would have worshipers say the psalm up until verse 13, and then the Levites or a temple prophet would proclaim a message of hope to the worshiper. It's not an either or, it could be a both and. In any event, in this last section of the poem, verses 13 and 14, we go back to the third person to refer to God, and then there's a second person addressing the speaker, the worshiper himself or herself. And by the way, I keep on saying him or her, himself or herself, because prayer in ancient Israel was not gendered. To be a priest in ancient Israel, to officiate at the altar when sacrifices were being performed at the altar, you had to be a male, and you had to be a male from a specific family. The vast majority of males could not have that job. But we know that prayers were recited by both men and women. Prayers even at the temple were recited by women. The story of Hannah, which we'll be reading in just over a week on Rosh Hashanah, is an example, since Hannah recites a psalm in 1 Samuel chapter 2. There are other cases elsewhere in the Bible. So prayer was not gendered. The Psalms could have been recited and were recited by both men and women. In any event, we see that there's a movement between stanzas, not only in terms of the three-part lines, but also in terms of the way that God is being discussed. Second person versus third person. And finally, the tone of the three sections of each section differs significantly from the other section. I'm curious, maybe people could either put into the chat or just briefly unmute yourselves. What's the tone of the first stanza, what I'm describing as the first stanza? That is to say, verses 1 through 6. Or if you had to give a one-word title or subtitle for the first stanza, or a 2 or 3 word subtitle for the first stanza, what might it be? Some thoughts here? Do people want to put something into the chat? I'll open the chat just to see. Or Emily, you've got an idea. Emily, can you unmute yourself, or does somebody here have to unmute you?
Got it. Take me too long to type into the chat. What I wanted to say, a couple of thoughts came to mind. Number one, I would say, I can't think of a title offhand, but I think the tone of the first stanza is quite confident.
Confident.
Confident. But the speaker seems to lose a little bit of that confidence as the poem continues. So
let's pause on the continuation. Let's just go stanza by stanza. So the first stanza, confident is a great word for the tone. I see Madeline has said the same thing, and Madeline suggested 2 different titles, maybe Help is on the Way and Invincible. I love them both. I especially love Help is on the Way because that's really vivid. I would say, though, that in a way, technically speaking, Invincible is even better, is even more accurate. Help is on the Way is more vivid, but Invincible is even more accurate because I think in a lot of verse 1, it's not even that the speaker needs help. The speaker is saying, I've got the help. Everything's fine. Should something go wrong, it won't be a problem because God's going to hide me away inviolable in his sukkah, or in his tent, in his temple. so that yeah, there's tremendous confidence here.
I actually have a
mhm.
different take on it,
Mhm.
and that is it's along the lines of methinks he does protest too much.
Interesting.
The one word that I would think of is fear. In other words, he's in a state of fear and mimi ira, and he's trying hard to convince himself that he has nothing to fear when the underlying tone is one of, oh my God, how am I going to get through this?
Interesting. Very interesting. And Madeline then agrees with you. She put into the chat, talking himself out of his fear. Bonnie, you've got a comment also.
Yeah, I think what Chaim said is really true, but I think it gets even more obvious in the second half where you can feel the desperation, right? Like, don't do this, don't do this. Like the first stanza is God will save me. I'm hoping, I'm thinking positive. I'm kind of manifesting positive in the hopes that Hashem will be there for me. But by the second stanza, it's beginning to turn. And those negative thoughts, the images of being eaten and all that kind of stuff are showing up in a stronger way.
Yeah. Great.
And again, the question is it external enemies or are they internal enemies?
Mm-hmm. So let's move into the second stanza. As Bonnie puts it, it turns. And actually, I would say it's not just that it begins to turn, it turns incredibly abruptly at the beginning of verse 7. At the beginning of verse 7, we go from at least a surface sense of confidence to real desperation. Shema Hashem, koli, ekra, v'choneni v'aneni. Hear my voice, Hashem. I'm crying out. Treat me with grace. Answer me. I'm trying to find you. Don't hide from me. This I'm trying to find your presence, but don't hide from me. There's a real sense that God is currently hiding. Don't push me away. Don't abandon me. So that the two different stanzas, at least on the surface, they move, I think, from confidence to fear, from extreme faith to doubt. Now I want to come back to some of Chaim and Bonnie's points, but Yael and Emily are waiting. So first Yael and then Emily.
I think they're all true. I think what's happening is we see the storms approaching, the storms of life. We know there are going to be hard times and we're gearing ourselves up to them, using our faith, using the resources of faith, saying, these storms are happening. I see the tsunami on its way to me, and God is going to hold me. Even if my parents are gone, even if everyone is trying to harm me, there's something above all of this that I can't see, that is bigger than these waves that are coming. And we're girding ourselves for that. And I think it's really appropriate that we're reading that right now, because as we approach the High Holy Days, in some ways it is like facing a storm. We know we're going to go, if we're on Zoom or if we're in person, we're going to go when we stand and say Al Chet. That's a really hard time. And it's a time where we're almost down on our knees. You know, we get down on our knees, in fact, and we grovel and we're thinking, I'm dust, I've done all these sins. And that's a hard thing to walk through if you're not reinforced by the love of God that we can take with us through all of this.
Great. Emily, then Lise, and then Michael. Emily, are you unmuting?
Sorry about that. I think he's also losing in confidence in himself, because it says, don't thrust your servant away in anger. Well, he must be concerned. Why should God be angry at him? So he knows something that he hasn't fully expressed yet. And that might be the doubts that are sort of the subtext of the confidence. And secondly, I wanted to say that before you asked that stanza, verse 13, he doesn't complete the sentence. I think he's afraid to complete the sentence because, oh my, he can't even utter the horror of what that would mean. So he reverts to Kaveh et Hashem. I will revert to my hope in you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's really important to see that in verse 13, he can't bring himself to finish the sentence.
Right.
He's gone too close to a really, really raw place. And that's why we just get ... In a sense, that ... is one of the most eloquent parts of the poem. When we read it in shul and we're kind of in a rush at the end of Shachri, we totally lose this. But to really read this correctly, you've got to say, Lulei ha'amanti lirot betuv Adonai be'eretz chayim. And then you've got to let that silence stay there. Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. Great point, Emily. Lisa, can you remind me, is it Lisa or Lisa?
It's Lisa.
Lisa, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good seeing you again. Nice to see you.
So I'm struck by how this word hiding has now flipped. So in stanza 1, he's being hidden, and now God is hiding. And if you have to hide, even if God is hiding you, I think if you have to hide, you're still not safe.
Yeah, so that comes back to a point that Chaim was making, and that Bonnie was making, which is that initially the first stanza is totally confident, and the second stanza is really quite desperate. But as you read more closely, the three of you are pointing out, even the first stanza has some intimations of desperation. You don't state this kind of confidence so strongly unless there's something that's threatening you. And so as Chaim put it, I think it was a Chaim or Bonnie, I can't remember, he's protesting too much. And I think that we see that there's actually, even though stanza 1 and stanza 2 seem to be almost opposites of each other, stanza 1 has the seeds of stanza 2 within it. And are there any elements of stanza? Yeah, Chaim?
I don't mean to be contrarian, but I really don't. I see something totally different in that second stanza. I see the stanza of Shema Hashem Koli and the rest of it as a turning point that is the answer to the fear and the sort of the neutrality of the fear, not addressing God, but rather the turning point in Shema Hashem Koli Ekra V'choneni V'aneni, and that in fact that's the beginning of the solution to his fear, and it's a statement. I mean, I see it as a very positive thing as opposed to desperation. To me, it's even if I have loss, and even if I have whatever, I've got God.
Gotcha. I want to come back to that point, Chaim, but Michael's been waiting. I don't know where Michael went.
Sorry, go ahead.
Where's Michael? Did we lose Michael? Oh dear. There was another hand up. There's a little yellow thing. Unfortunately, I think we lost Michael. I wanted to take 3 more comments, and then I want to sort of start summing up, and also looking at that the last 2 lines. Emily again, then Bonnie, then Lisa.
Excuse me, I don't really know why that hand is up because I didn't want to say.
Okay.
The
Gotcha.
person
Okay.
next to me has her hand up.
Okay, Bonnie, great.
Bonnie, right.
Okay, cool. I also think there's a change of language in the second stanza. it feels more to me, more kind of traditional. I'm going to say tefillah, biblical language, anenu, bakasha, that I'm going to cry and God will answer. The language there feels to me a little bit stronger in the using of the kind of biblical phrases, that even though I know there is some in the first, right? But the first is like, Lachso b'noam Hashem u'levaker b'heichalo. That's a really lovely, beautiful, poetic line. It's not the desperation of, I'm crying out and I want God to hear me. And I just think it's really striking that the stanza begins with the word Shema. I'm right. And it's Shema Hashem. Like we're used to hearing it the other way, Shema Yisrael, right? And there's a quite a deliberate flip that he or whoever is really not sure if anybody is listening, if anybody is coming, is going to hear him. So the language of this is just getting more and more intense and hearkening back to what I'm going to call, to me, this feels like a very kind of traditional sort of Yom Kippur-ish in that kind of sense of the language of what's happening in the second stanza.
Great, great. And Lisa?
So there's also, unlike in other Psalms where God smites enemies, God is not doing any smiting here. This is a very chronic problem. This problem does not seem to be going away. He's ostensibly going to be hidden forever. And I'm thinking that perhaps that's why that leads to the ambiguity of that verse 13. There's no resolution in this song.
Interesting, no resolution. I want to come back to that idea. Very, very interesting. Yeah, as Bonnie points out, the middle stanza sounds familiar, especially the request for grace, choneni va'aneni, very much part of liturgy of this time of year. Treat us with great grace, answer us. That's what we're saying, in Slichot throughout Aseret Yemei HaTeshuvah, and then especially on Yom Kippur. So let me draw a few of these, many of these observations together. On the surface, I think that we've got two very different stanzas, the stanza about confidence and then the stanza of desperation, the stanza that's full of trust, faith, bitachon, and the stanza that's full of petition, the bakasha. But as a number of people have been noticing, there are elements of the other, there are elements of the second stanza in the first stanza, and there are elements of the first in the second. The first stanza is stating the confidence with such force that I think that we're justified in thinking that there's something beneath there. There's something underneath this insistent confidence. If you're so insistent about your confidence, it probably means that there's something making you question your confidence. I don't know if people remember, but last week I also talked about how verse 2 is sort of surprising. The second line of verse 2 reads, Sarai v'oyevaili hema chashalu v'nafalu. And I mentioned last time that this is an odd biblical line because it's not, it could easily have classical A, B, C, A prime, B prime, C prime parallelism, in which each of the two versets would make a complete statement. That's very typical of biblical poetry, that a single verset makes a single short statement, and then the second verset echoes that statement, sometimes like almost word by word, just using synonyms. And we could rearrange these words to make it into a typical biblical verset. Sarai kashalu, v'oivaili nafalu. My enemies stumbled and my foes fell down. That would be a very typical biblical Hebrew poetic line. By putting the two subjects in the first line and the two predicates, the two verbs in the second line, the line creates a little bit of suspense. We're not sure what the tsarai and oivai, what the enemies and the foes are going to do. Are they going to lash out at me? Are they going to cause me to suffer? Well, no, it turns out that we get to the second verset and no, they're the ones who have problems, not me. But if you wanted to be, immediately confident, it would have been better to have a more typical biblical line with a subject and a predicate, and then the second verset would have another subject and a parallel subject and a parallel predicate, by putting the subjects first and then the predicate second, which is actually, as I say, unusual. This is a case of, if any of you are very into poetry, this is a case of enjambment, and ancient Hebrew poetry tends not to use enjambment. By doing it this way, there is a little bit of anxiety that is raised up at the beginning of this line in the second part of verse 2, and then is put back down. But that anxiety is in fact there. And similarly, when we get to the second stanza, there's a tone of desperation. But as Chaim is pointing out, the very fact that starting in literally the first word of the second stanza, the speaker is turning to God for help, means that the speaker has some expectation that God will listen and that God has the ability to help. So the bedrock underlying this desperation stanza is in fact some sense of confidence, some sense of bitachon. The person's not nihilistically desperate. The person's desperate, but knows where to turn for help. And in that sense, the second stanza is maybe a little, has seeds of the first stanza, just as the first stanza has seeds of the second. Going to the concluding section, and especially that very last line, I think that we now go to sort of a third place, which is maybe a synthesis of the first two. The idea of hope, the idea of becoming strong, and then again, the word hope showing up in the third verset of this concluding line. Hope is somewhere between desperation and trust, closer to trust, but I think not quite the same thing as full-fledged confidence or trust. Trust or confidence, I think, means that, we know everything's going to be fine, everything is fine. Hope means that we have a realistic expectations that things may become fine. It's not quite as strong as bitachon. I think tikva is not quite as strong as bitachon, but it's on the way there. And so I think when we go through the three stanzas of this poem, we see that this poem is taking us on a journey from extraordinary confidence, which maybe belies a lack of confidence, through desperation, which still is rooted in some form of faith, into hope, a less than full confidence, but some expectation that things can become better. And this journey is interesting, I think, especially in two ways. First of all, I think this is very, very significant. The order in which these stanzas appear is not the order in which we might have expected them to appear. That is to say, it doesn't, the stanzas don't go in what we might have thought of as the conventional religious order. This is not a poem that brings us from doubt to faith. It's actually a poem that brings us from faith to doubt, and then from doubt to hope. We're not ascending a ladder of conventional piety. This is a more complex, and dare I say, a more mature form of piety that we're getting in Psalm 27. In fact, I think we might even go a little bit further. There's a scholar, there was a scholar named Gerald Blitzstein, Yaakov Blitzstein. I don't know if some of you might have known him. I think he was originally, might have been from New York, made Aliyah, as a professor at Ben Gurion University in Jewish thought for many, many years. In one of his earliest essays, which appeared in the Yavne magazine back in the 60s, I think he must have still been a graduate student or maybe a rabbinical student at RIETS at the time, he suggests that the first stanza is actually deeply problematic from a religious point of view. I think he would go so far as to say the first stanza is the stanza that's full not just of confidence and faith, but of hubris. The speaker in the first stanza thinks that he's got God in his in his hip pocket. He knows exactly what God's going to do. And in a sense, in the first stanza, God isn't even allowed to have any freedom because the speaker knows all about God. But it's also interesting to remember that that first stanza is the stanza that only talks about God in the third person. The speaker in the first stanza speaks about God as an academic subject that he's mastered, but he doesn't speak to God. He speaks about God, not to God. He doesn't address God. God is a topic in the first stanza, a topic, in which the speaker is going to get an A plus. But the speaker in the first stanza is not yet in relationship with God. Then interestingly, when we move into the second stanza, it's only then that the speaker addresses God. And the moment the speaker addresses God, the moment the speaker is in relationship with God, vulnerabilities come out. A relationship is a whole different story than knowing a subject backwards and forwards. When you're in relationship, the other side of the relationship is not always predictable. That's true when we're dealing with human beings, all the more so when the other side of the relationship is a being of an entirely different order. And so relationship, moving from knowledge about into addressing, that move is a move that makes the speaker vulnerable. And as soon as the speaker makes that move, suddenly the insecurities, the fears, they come right out. And we end up having actually a much more realistic, much more adult sort of faith. The faith, the religiosity, the piety of the first stanza, I dare say, is a rather childish faith. It may be the sort of faith that people associate with deep religiosity, but really it's a form of shallow religiosity, which we can see from the fact that the speaker in this first stanza is only speaking about God. The second stanza is much, much more realistic. It is actually the case in the world that often God seems to be hiding God's face, that God's presence is palpable, but not quite present. And it's only in the second stanza that the speaker is acknowledging that fact. In the second stanza, we're getting into, I think, a much deeper, a much more serious, but a rather more scary, more frightening form of piety, but a much more adult type of piety that then leads to the hopeful, realistic, but not hubristic end of the psalm. The psalm, that ending that gets us into tikva, that gets us into hope. At the very, very end of the psalm, whoever is speaking to the worshiper, whoever is addressing the worshiper, whether it's a Levite, a prophet, or the worshiper is addressing him or herself, at the end of the psalm, we don't have complete confidence. God's freedom is not being impinged by my hubris, but we do have hope. We do have some realistic expectation that God in some form, maybe not in the expected form, maybe not in the form that we would most have preferred, that God will become present. We don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly how, but we can hope that God will be present. So I think that Psalm 27 to me is really one of the most theologically suggestive, theologically significant texts in the entire Tanakh. It's not unique. There are other texts that do this as well. But I think that Psalm 27 is modeling for us a mature piety, and it's showing us that what people think is the best form of piety may not be the best form of piety. It may be the most childish, the simplest, but also the most simplistic form of piety. And in Psalm 27, we're starting a journey that leads to a much more adult form of piety. I also think that it's very, very interesting that the psalm ends on a note of hope rather than a note of victory. And in this respect, Psalm 27 reminds me of some other famous Jewish texts. First of all, Psalm 27 reminds me of the Chumash, of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses are remarkable in ancient literature because they don't end with the triumph of the human hero. the human hero, Moshe, doesn't achieve victory at the end of the 5 books of Moses. Instead of ending with triumph, the 5 books of Moses, spoiler alert, they end with the death of the main character rather than his victory. But it's not just simply a death. It ends with him, the moments before he dies, looking across the Jordan River at the promised land that he'll never enter, but he has a reasonable hope that his successor, his sidekick, is going to lead the people successfully into the promised land. So the Torah ends not with a note of victory, but with a note of hope. By the way, it's interesting just to speculate. What if the Torah kept on going? What if the book of Joshua were part of the Torah? And there is a theory, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it's an interesting theory nonetheless. There is a theory among some scholars that maybe in antiquity, the Torah originally had 6 parts, and instead of a Pentateuch, there was a Hexateuch that ended at the end of the book of Joshua. I don't know whether that's true or not. What I think it's a theory that's worth thinking about, simply because it suggests the possibility, what would Judaism be like if the book of Joshua were part of the Torah, if we ended not with hope, but with victory? There's a great biblical scholar who taught actually across the street from JTS at the Union Theological Seminary, named James Sanders, one of the great Protestant biblical scholars of the late 20th century. And Professor Sanders, Zichrono Livracha, suggested that, if there had been a Hexateuch, maybe the Jews wouldn't have survived all these years. Maybe the fact that their core religious book, the Torah, ended on a note of hope rather than victory, allowed them to endure 2,000 years of exile. And maybe if the Torah had ended, as some scholars suggest was the case in antiquity, had ended with the book of Joshua, they wouldn't have been able to handle the exile. That once they didn't have the victory, they would have fallen apart the way all other ancient peoples have fallen apart. And so in ending on a note of hope, I think that Psalm 27 resembles the Torah and is reminding us of something that's really, really significant about the Torah. The other text that Psalm 27 reminds me of, the other significant Jewish text, is Hatikva, is the Zionist anthem, which then later became, of course, the Israeli national anthem. It's really quite interesting that the Zionist anthem, the Israeli national anthem, doesn't have the title, let's say, Hanitzachon, the victory, but rather has the title, the hope. There is something quite Psalm 27-ish about that choice of text as the Zionist anthem and as the Israeli national anthem. So I think that Psalm 27 is finally, just one final comment here. It actually, to me, sort of sums up the whole book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is a remarkably varied anthology of religious poetry, of poetic prayers, some of them hymns of praise that are tremendously exuberant, some of them songs of thanksgiving that remember a recent threat, a recent problem that God has helped us to avert. Some of them songs of crisis that are crying out for help. Psalm 27 kind of takes us through these various moods, and the order in which it does so, I think, is very, very significant. It doesn't end exuberantly on a note of triumph, which would have been the easy way out, which would have been what the shallowest and most common form of religion does, but nor does it end sort of nihilistically or in despair, but in ending with hope. I think it models what a mature Jewish faith is supposed to look like. And in that respect, it really resembles the book of Psalms as a whole, a book that I sometimes would I like giving the title, the book of faith and doubt. Psalm 27 is a song that reminds us that doubt is an integral part of a healthy faith. A faith that has no doubt is a shallow doubt, is a pretend doubt, what Professor Blitzstein called an ersatz faith. But a real serious faith, a mature Jewish faith, is a faith that encompasses doubt, gives room for doubt, and then in some small way moves beyond the doubt, however briefly at the end. Okay, we have 3 minutes, so maybe we can just go a few minutes over. There are some hands that have been waiting, and there may be some other questions or comments. So Madeline, I'm sorry, you've been waiting for quite a while. Yes, Madeline.
So you made this beautiful case for those final lines as the anthem of hope. So I apologize for taking it in the opposite direction. But there's something disturbing that I feel about those final lines, that this is line 13 is this moment of ... despair. It's the true doubt. It's imagining if God is not actually going to show up ... And then, and I'm playing it different ways in my head, depending, is this the person themselves? Is this an outside voice? But there's a silencing, there's a command. No, hope is you have to cut off that thought. And you could even, rather than pause in that silence, the sentence is coming out and then the hope just comes as, nope, quiet, we're gonna end this thing with a series of commands. You must hope. You cannot go that far down the doubt spiral. So in some sense, I feel like the final conclusion has these two forces both going strong, locked in each other, and we don't yet have the synthesis. We have the two sides in struggle, and that's where we end. So anyway,
I hear what you're saying, but Madeline, I don't quite agree with your reading of verse 13. I don't think that verse 13 is a statement of despair. I mean, the verbal meaning of verse 13 is the opposite. The person is saying, it is the case that I believe that I will see the arrival of God, or I believe I will see God's virtue in the land of the living. But while saying that, the person's also contemplating the opposite. The person says, if it weren't for the case that I believe, and I do believe, but if it weren't, Gewalt, I'd be a basket case. And so by saying, on the one hand, the person's asserting that he or she believes, but on the other hand, the person's also entertaining the possibility that I might not believe.
Trying to vividly imagine. They're about to vividly imagine what would that world be, and that's when the voice inside or the other voice shuts it down. That's
interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I see. So the way I'm reading it, and this is a case where there's no one right or wrong answer. I think there, as is often the case with good poetry, and especially with performed poetry, which is what this was in the ancient world, where different performers might handle it differently, might use a different tone of voice or a different melody or a slightly different rhythm. But the way that I would read it is that the speaker is entertaining that possibility, is still saying, is more on the faith side of the ledger, but is entertaining the possibility that I know what it would be like if I didn't have faith. And then that's just so scary that the speaker can't finish the sentence. I do think that's scary, but it's not quite the same as despair. I think that a lot would depend on how you read this out loud, how you perform this. If you perform this, you could perform this the way that I'm suggesting, with a ... with just a little bit of a pause, with some silence, and then we get the statement that you should have hope. On the other hand, you could also perform this in such a way that the person raises the possibility that I might not have hope, though I do, and then the person just gets shut up. And so in other words, if at the end of verse 13, instead of a pause, the other voice comes in and just like speaks over the first speaker, that would be a much more negative way to end the poem. I'm thinking that we can end the poem with that pause at the end of 13, let the person go almost to the scary place, and then somebody, and it may even be the speaker himself or herself, rather than an outside person, a Levite or a prophet, comes up with the idea of hope. I see what you're saying. I mean, as is often the case with great poetry, we could take it more than one direction, and especially, like, it depends on, like, if you're a director and you're telling an actor how to do this. If you're a director and you're deciding whether there's going to be one voice or two voices here, you could really take this in very, very different directions. And I think that's really important to remember about the Psalms, that they were performed texts. They're not like a poem in the New Yorker, you know, where you just read it. There were performers who did this in the temple, and different performers might handle it differently. But I do still see ending on a note of hope as being positive in a useful way, but not so Pollyannish, not so, you know, insistently positive as to no longer be realistic to people who have lived in what's actually a very complex world where God's presence isn't always obvious. Time for a couple of other comments, Bonnie, and then Yael, and then Emily. Mm-hmm. Yes, Bonnie? Still trying to unmute? Go to another set. We'll go on to Yael, and we'll see if we can come back to you, Bonnie. Yael.
I'd like to reflect on what you said about this possibility of a sixth book of the Torah where Bnei Israel is entering the land. I think there's a strong parallel between the fact that we have not arrived at Zman HaMashiach. And so the Torah is often parallel with where we are. I don't know how it's going to be in Zman HaMashiach, if they're going to add more books to the Torah in order to reflect that. But for now, even historically and certainly currently, the 5 books of Moses where he's looking from Mount Har Pisgah, and he sees the land, he sees this hope, this vision that we have for Zman HaMashiach, but we're not there. And I think that's a helpful parallel.
Yeah, I think the philosopher, the Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, has spoken about an asymptotic side of Judaism. Other modern Jewish philosophers have picked this up as well. That it's characteristic of Judaism that we're always getting closer to redemption, but at least some modern Jewish thinkers think that it's essential to Judaism that we never quite get there. And I think that also reflects the fact that we have a 5-book Torah and not a 6-book Torah. Even if we don't go as far as that idea, and we think that, yes, someday we will get there, the fact that we've got a 5-book Torah in the meantime makes it possible for us to stay on a journey and to realize that arriving at where you're going isn't really always necessary. I mean, Moses was the greatest Jew of all time, not because he completed his task, but because he never desisted from his task. This idea, reminds us of the passage that I'm alluding to in Pirkei Avot. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor v'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. It's not your responsibility to finish the task, but you're not free to not even try. Moses was a hero not because he got there, but because he always tried, or pretty much always tried. 2 more comments before we end. Emily, then Bonnie. 4 more. Okay, Emily, Bonnie, 3 more. Emily, Bonnie, and then Chaim, and then we should finish up. Emily.
I just want you to say that I don't think God is victorious either at the end of Devarim, because he gave us all these rules to behave a certain way, and we don't know yet if we're going to fail or not fail. So even God, I mean, there's Moshe on the one hand, but if you're talking about the patterns of ancient epics of where the heroes are victorious, I would say that God is not victorious either, that we don't know, because after all, it's Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh, I will be what I will be. And maybe that's about how it depends how the Jews act. The other thing I just wanted to say, paraphrase, I don't remember the exact quote, but Lord Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, said about hope, that hope is something like this: hope is the victory of the improbable over the probable. Something along those lines.
יפה, יפה.
So I just love that. That's all.
תודה. Bonnie?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. This is actually thanks to Madeline for talking about whether verse 12 or 13, where the break is. I'm really bothered by the end of Pasuk 12, where it ends with the term Hamas. That, like, if that is really the break in the speakers and the voice and the answer from the Levium, whatever we're calling it, it's like it opened, the whole psalm opened with God, with Adonai, and it went down to Hamas. Like, there is such a descent there, right? And then it says, Lule Hemanti, like, okay, maybe. So,
Well,
yeah.
So I think the second stanza may end at the end of 12, but if there's another voice, the other voice doesn't come up until 14.
Right.
The speaker of 13 is still the main speaker of the psalm, who's been speaking up until now.
Oh, the speaker is 13, right? Okay.
Speaker 13.
Okay, and then 14 is the end. So then it ends with three-part verse sets, which is just so, because I kept thinking about where the divisions were within the speakers and the voices here, you know, and it could be in a couple of different places there.
I think we could debate whether we want to end stanza 2 at the end of 12 or 13, but if there's another voice, it's
definitely 14.
It's definitely 14. Yeah,
right.
It's definitely 14.
Yeah, but there is really that descent that has gone down all the way to Hamas, and when you think about it.
But then we rise back up again in 14. And even in 13, although the possibility of not having faith is being thought about, the actual statement is the person does have faith. So I think you're right about the descent, but I think that the descent begins to move, to reverse itself in 13, and then more significantly, but not Pollyannishly, continues to move in the opposite direction in 14.
Right.
Actually,
Chaim, one last comment, and then we should.
I'm glad the last stanza begins with 13, because it ends with the previous stanza ends with Hamas, and then it's Lule Hemanti. It's no longer Shema. It is, were it not for my faith. And the answer to that is Lirot Betuv Hashem, to see the good. To me, I hear it as the saying, Miha Isha Chafetz Chaim. The answer is, what is it? It's not that that's part of the question. It's the answer to that. And I see Kaveh Hashem, and again, you can read it every which way, you know, but to me, Kaveh Hashem is not someone else saying it, but rather me saying to myself, I believe, and yes, that hope is going to get me through. Kaveh Hashem, I'm saying to myself, in as a way of to entreat myself, despite the Hamas of the end of the last stanza, with hope and with that you can sort of you can have some strength.
That's a good place to conclude. So I hope that I have made our daily reading of this psalm at this time of year a little bit richer, and I hope that I've also given a sense of how this psalm, and I think the book of Psalms as a whole, models for us a certain kind of mature faith, and at this time of year especially, it's worth remembering what a mature Jewish faith looks like. Tov, toda rabah, and shana tova u'mituka l'kulam u'lechol Yisrael. Toda. Shana tova. Bye-bye.
Thank you to all of the participants as well for contributing. And there's still 6 classes this week, and there are going to be a smattering of classes during Tishrei too, between the Chagim. So you can find out about those at elul.drisha.org, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.